Good evening, my dear friends, and welcome to another journey into the perplexing labyrinth of human ingenuity and folly. Dr. John Watson here, from the gaslit streets of late 19th century London. Tonight I invite you to step into the hallowed, yet often shadowed chambers of 221B Baker Street, where my estimable companion, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, awaits the next intellectual challenge. Prepare yourselves for a tale that will weave through the opulent drawing rooms and the murky alleyways of this grand city, a mystery born from the silent chords of a maestro's final composition. It is a case that tested even Holmes's formidable intellect, revealing secrets hidden not just in the notes of a score, but in the very souls of men. If you find yourselves intrigued by the unravelling of such intricate puzzles, I urge you to subscribe to the channel, for there are many more chronicles awaiting your discovery. Now, let's begin with the first chapter of The Dying Composer. Chapter 1. The Silent Maestro of Cadogan Square. It was a morning of the most dispiriting sort, even for a London January. A persistent, bone-chilling mist had cloaked the city, muffling the usual clamour into a spectral hush, and even the stout heartiness of our Baker Street fire seemed inadequate against its pervasive dampness. Holmes, ensconced in his armchair, was engaged in one of his characteristic profound meditations, a veritable statue of contemplation with his fingertips pressed together and his gaze fixed upon the ceiling. I, meanwhile, was engrossed in a ponderous medical journal, seeking solace in the logical certainties of anatomy against the oppressive gloom. Our quietude was abruptly shattered by a most vigorous pounding upon our door, followed by a frantic peal of the bell. Before I could rise, our landlady, Mrs. Hudson, had already ushered in a figure whose disarray spoke volumes of distress. She was a woman of delicate features, though now quite haggard, her elegant morning attire askew, and her eyes wide with a terror that made the breath catch in one's throat. "Mr. Holmes," she gasped, clutching at her chest as if to contain a fracturing heart. "You must come at once. It is Professor Thorne. My husband, Elias. He is gone." Holmes, ever a man of immediate action once roused, sprang to his feet. "Compose yourself, madam. I am Sherlock Holmes. This is my colleague, Dr. Watson. Pray, tell us what has transpired." She introduced herself, somewhat breathlessly, as Mrs. Eleanor Thorne, wife of the renowned composer, Professor Elias Thorne. "I found him this morning, Mr. Holmes, in his study, quite still. He seemed at peace, yet so terribly wrong. The servants cannot account for it. The doctor says it is sudden, but there is something amiss." Within the hour a hansom cab had borne us swiftly through the spectral streets to Cadogan Square, a bastion of aristocratic quietude where the grand houses stood like silent stone sentinels. Professor Thorne's residence was a magnificent affair, replete with heavy oak doors and gleaming brass. We were admitted by a stern-faced butler, Mr. Davies, whose composure seemed forged of iron, though a flicker of profound unease danced in his eyes. "The study, gentlemen," he intoned, leading us down a hushed corridor and pausing before a heavy mahogany door. It was locked from the inside. Holmes's eyes, usually a cold grey, now sparked with a keen, almost predatory light. He examined the doorframe, the lock, and even the carpet before turning the handle. The room we entered was a sanctuary of artistic creation and scholarly pursuit, yet now it felt like a mausoleum. Walls lined with towering bookshelves groaned under the weight of countless scores and volumes. A grand piano, its lid closed, stood silently in one corner, a silent testament to its master's genius. And there, slumped in a large leather armchair before a formidable writing desk, was Professor Elias Thorne. He was a man of distinguished mien, even in his stillness, with silver hair and a noble brow. His hand rested upon a half-written musical score, his spectacles still perched upon his nose. There was no visible mark of violence, no struggle. He seemed simply to have fallen into an eternal slumber, though the peculiar, almost startled expression upon his face hinted at something more than a natural passing. The air was heavy, not just with the scent of old paper and leather, but with a faint, almost imperceptible fragrance, vaguely floral, yet with an unusual metallic undertone that prickled at the back of my throat. Holmes moved with a feline grace, his gaze sweeping over every detail. He first knelt beside the professor, examining his face, his hands, and the meticulous arrangement of the desk. "Watson, if you would be so kind as to make your preliminary examination." As I performed my duties, noting the absence of obvious injury and the coldness of his skin, Holmes's long, slender fingers delicately probed the desktop. He lifted the spectacles, scrutinized the musical score with an intensity that surprised me, for he possessed no great love of music beyond its mathematical precision. He then picked up a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird, no larger than my thumb, which lay near the professor's still hand. It was made of some dark exotic wood, highly polished, and seemed utterly out of place amidst the scholarly paraphernalia. "A peculiar ornament, would you not agree, Watson?" Holmes murmured, turning the bird over in his fingers. "Mrs. Thorne, was this customarily found upon your husband's desk?" Mrs. Thorne, who had remained by the door, her face a mask of grief, shook her head weakly. "No, Mr. Holmes. I have never seen it before. Elias was not one for trinkets, especially not such an intricate piece." Holmes's lips curled into a faint smile, a sign that his intellect had already begun to gnaw at the edges of the mystery. "Indeed. And the scent, madam? Do you notice anything unusual in the air?" She inhaled cautiously. "Perhaps a touch of jasmine. Elias did enjoy the scent of flowers, but usually in the conservatory." "Jasmine, yes. But something else," Holmes mused, his nostrils flaring slightly. He then moved to a small, ornate silver box on the desk, its lid slightly ajar. Inside lay several quills and a small, delicate crystal vial, now empty. He picked up the vial, holding it to the light. It still held a faint residue, and as I leaned closer, I recognized the subtle, metallic tang that had earlier troubled me. "This, Watson, is not jasmine," Holmes said, his voice low and serious. "This, I believe, is our first true lead, a very potent and rather subtle lead." He looked around the room once more, his eyes lingering on the locked door, the undisturbed window, and finally upon the silent, half-finished score, as if the very notes might whisper their secret to him. The case of Professor Elias Thorne, the dying composer, had begun. Chapter 2. The Whispering Scroll and the Shabby Scholar. The following afternoon saw Holmes and me far removed from the hushed elegance of Cadogan Square. Our pursuit of the peculiar wooden bird and the crystal vial had led us deep into the labyrinthine alleys behind Charing Cross Road, a district teeming with second-hand bookshops, antique dealers, and establishments of questionable repute. The fog, though less dense, still clung stubbornly, lending an air of conspiratorial secrecy to the crooked streets. Holmes, with his deerstalker pulled low and his Inverness cape billowing about him, cut an imposing figure amidst the jostling crowds. He had spent the morning in meticulous research, consulting obscure chemical texts and comparing handwriting samples from Professor Thorne's papers. The empty vial, he declared, contained traces of a rare and potent alkaloid derived from a South American plant, a poison so subtle it left almost no trace, yet inflicted its victim with a sudden, overwhelming paralysis of the heart, often mimicking natural causes. Our destination was a particularly dingy establishment named the Antiquarian's Nook, a shop crammed to the rafters with musty tomes, faded maps, and an assortment of curiosities from every corner of the empire. The air inside was thick with the scent of aged paper and dust, and a single gas lamp struggled valiantly against the encroaching shadows. Behind a towering barricade of books hunched over a microscope sat the proprietor, a diminutive, bespectacled man with a perpetually furrowed brow and ink-stained fingers. Mr. Mortimer Finch, as he was introduced, resembled nothing so much as an owl startled from its contemplation. "Good day, Mr. Finch," Holmes announced, his voice cutting through the silence. "We're making inquiries regarding a certain item, a small carved wooden bird, perhaps 3 inches in length, of dark, exotic wood." Mr. Finch peered over his spectacles, his eyes, magnified by thick lenses, blinking rapidly. "A bird, you say? Many birds pass through these hands, sir. Figurines, carvings from all corners of the globe. You're specific about its provenance?" Holmes described the bird with precision, detailing the unusual grain and the unique style of carving. "It is of South American origin, I believe. Perhaps a piece known as a pajarito de la selva." Mr. Finch's eyes widened slightly. "Ah, you possess an unusual knowledge, sir. Indeed, I recall such a piece, a rare find, carved by the indigenous tribes of the Amazon basin. It was brought to me by a rather impecunious gentleman perhaps 3 weeks ago. And this gentleman, Mr. Finch, Holmes pressed, his gaze unwavering. Could you describe him? Thin, stooped, with an air of academic neglect, Finch replied, adjusting his spectacles, carried a roll of parchment under his arm, spoke with a quiet passion about ancient music. Old scores. He said he needed funds for a vital project. I offered him a pittance for the bird, a mere 2 guineas, yet he accepted with alacrity. A roll of parchment, you say? I interjected. Was it a musical score? Indeed, he called it a lost work, a composition of forgotten beauty. He seemed quite proud of it, despite his impoverished state. Mr. Finch pointed a skeletal finger towards a dimly lit shelf. He spent a good hour poring over these volumes, searching, I believe, for obscure references to his work. A Miss Theodora Croft, if memory serves, a musicologist of some distinction. Holmes took a small notebook from his pocket. And his name, Mr. Finch? Did he provide one? He did, though I confess my memory for such transient particulars is often fleeting. Ah, yes. He called himself Silas Thorne, claimed to be a distant relation of the late professor. A nephew, perhaps? My breath caught. Silas Thorne. Professor Thorne's family was quite estranged, I believe. His sister passed years ago, childless. Holmes merely nodded, a glint in his eye. A curious coincidence, would you not agree, Watson? The bird found at the scene, linked to a man claiming familial ties, bearing the same surname, and a forgotten score, a lost work. He turned back to Finch. Do you recall the title of this lost work? Mr. Finch scratched his chin. I recall only a fragment of Latin from its opening page, something about Requiem for a Silent Sky. He was particularly insistent upon its authenticity. Thank you, Mr. Finch. Your information has been invaluable. Holmes paid for a small, dusty volume of rare plants that he had picked up, and we stepped back into the street. Silas Thorne, I mused aloud. If he is related, why the secrecy? And the poison? Did he mean for the bird to be found, or was it merely overlooked? Holmes strode purposefully, his mind clearly racing. The bird, Watson, was a gift, or perhaps a payment. The poison, a meticulously planned act. The Requiem for a Silent Sky, and Miss Theodora Croft. These are our next threads. A man impoverished, yet passionate about a lost score, seeking funds, bearing a unique poison, and connected, however tenuously, to our victim. The pieces, though scattered, begin to coalesce into a discernible pattern. We must seek out this Miss Croft, and learn more of this Silas Thorne and his purported masterpiece. The fog seemed to deepen, but Holmes's mind had found its clearing. Chapter 3. The Cryptic Manuscript and the Maestro's Shadow. Our inquiries into Miss Theodora Croft led us to a most unexpected quarter. A dimly lit bohemian art studio nestled amidst the grime and grandeur of Chelsea. The air here was redolent with turpentine, linseed oil, and a faint, sweet smell of pipe tobacco. It was not a place one would readily associate with musicology, yet the address had been explicit. The building itself was a converted riverside warehouse, its windows grimy with the Thames's perpetual breath, looking out upon the churning grey waters. We found Miss Croft amidst a glorious chaos of canvases, easels, and discarded paintbrushes. She was a striking woman of perhaps 35, with a cascade of fiery red hair, intelligent, piercing green eyes, and an intensity that seemed to vibrate around her. Though dressed in a paint-splattered smock, her bearing was one of formidable intellect and refined sensibility. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, she greeted us, wiping her hands on a rag, her voice possessing a surprising depth and warmth. I confess, your visit is a puzzle. My current passion is portraiture, not musical scholarship, though I dabble in both, it is true. Indeed, Miss Croft, Holmes began, his eyes sweeping over the vibrant, unfinished portraits that adorned the walls. We understand you're acquainted with a gentleman named Silas Thorne, and perhaps his work, Requiem for a Silent Sky. Her expressive face clouded with a mixture of recognition and irritation. Silas. Yes, I know Silas. He is a rather unfortunate protégé of my late father, a musicologist himself. Silas is a man obsessed, Mr. Holmes. A brilliant talent, perhaps, but deeply consumed by the ghosts of the past. He believes he has unearthed a genuine masterpiece, a lost composition by the legendary 18th-century Venetian composer Giovanni Battista Pergolese. Pergolese? I exclaimed, surprised. Not his own work. No, Dr. Watson. That is the core of Silas's mania. He claims to have found Pergolese's forgotten Requiem, a work believed lost in a fire. He has devoted years, and I suspect what little family inheritance he had, to proving its authenticity. He came to me a few weeks ago, desperate for funds, attempting to sell me a share of its future earnings, but I am no patron of such ventures, nor do I believe in such miraculous resurrections. He had the manuscript with him? Holmes inquired. Oh, yes, a magnificent aged scroll bound in supple leather. He spoke of having recovered it from a forgotten archive, but the details were always vague. He showed me the opening passages, the Latin invocation. It was beautiful, undeniably, but the handwriting, it was so fresh, so precise, for a manuscript supposedly 2 centuries old. She paused, a thoughtful frown creasing her brow. In fact, the hand was remarkably similar to Elias Thorne's own elegant script. A tremor of excitement passed through me. Professor Elias Thorne? Indeed, Miss Croft confirmed. I remember remarking upon it at the time. Silas dismissed it as a coincidence, saying that such an eminent composer would naturally possess an elegant hand, but I found it curious. Elias Thorne had a particular flourish to his E's and T's, a subtle characteristic Silas's manuscript seemed to share. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And Professor Thorne, was he aware of this lost Pergolese Requiem? Oh, most certainly, Miss Croft replied, a note of bitterness entering her voice. Elias and Silas had a profound disagreement about it. Elias, being the foremost authority on Pergolese in England, was utterly convinced it was a forgery. He even wrote an article, a scathing critique, discrediting the manuscript entirely, saying it was a clever pastiche, not a genuine lost work. That was several months ago. It created quite a rift between them. Silas was furious, accused Elias of professional jealousy, of trying to steal his thunder. He believed Elias coveted the fame of such a discovery for himself. And since that article, have the 2 men met? Holmes asked, leaning forward intently. Miss Croft hesitated. I believe so, yes. Silas was desperate to convince Elias of the manuscript's authenticity, to force him to retract his damning article. He swore he would make Elias see the truth no matter the cost. She looked at us, her expression now etched with alarm. You are suggesting... We are merely connecting threads, Miss Croft, Holmes said smoothly. Your father, you mentioned, was a musicologist. Did Silas Thorne perhaps acquire the pajarito de la selva from your family's collection? A small carved wooden bird from South America? Her eyes widened. My goodness, yes. My father collected such curiosities. It vanished some months ago. We assumed it was misplaced or stolen by one of the more unsavoury characters who sometimes frequented his studio. Silas was a frequent visitor. Holmes merely smiled, a cold knowing smile. The bird, the manuscript, the shared handwriting, the bitter professional rivalry, the poison. The maestro's shadow, Miss Croft, now seems to extend rather darkly over his own former student. We are deeply indebted to you. Good day. As we left the chaotic studio, the scent of the river carrying a chill in the air, I felt a shiver run down my spine. Holmes, are you suggesting Silas Thorne forged the Pergolese Requiem and then murdered his mentor to silence his accusations? The evidence points overwhelmingly in that direction, Watson, Holmes replied, hailing a passing hansom. But the method of entry, the locked room, still remains to be fully elucidated, and the financial motive, though strong, needs further corroboration. There are still shadows to pierce, my dear fellow, before we bring this particular composition to its grim crescendo. Chapter 4. The Patron's Secret and the Poisoned Legacy. The following day, Holmes led us to a world far removed from the bohemian studios and antique shops, the opulent, hushed salons of a prominent Mayfair estate. Our next port of call was Sir Alister Redfern, a name synonymous with patronage of the arts, particularly music. He had been a close friend and fervent supporter of Professor Elias Thorne for decades. The drawing room we were ushered into was a symphony of silk and polished mahogany, filled with priceless art and the faint aroma of expensive cigars. Sir Alister was a man of impressive stature and aristocratic bearing, his silver hair impeccably groomed, his eyes shrewd and intelligent. He greeted us with a sombre dignity, clearly still grieving the loss of his friend. "Gentlemen," he began, gesturing us to take seats in plush velvet armchairs, This business with Elias is a profound tragedy. A light gone out too soon. He was a genius, unparalleled." "Indeed, Sir Alistair," Holmes acknowledged. "We are investigating the circumstances surrounding Professor Thorne's sudden demise. Our inquiries have led us to a disputed musical manuscript, purportedly a lost Pergolese requiem, championed by a gentleman named Silas Thorne." Sir Alistair's jaw tightened perceptibly. "Ah, Silas Thorne. A troublesome fellow, I'm afraid. Elias spoke of him frequently, with a mixture of exasperation and pity. The manuscript, yes. Elias was convinced it was a forgery. A very clever one, he admitted, but a forgery nonetheless. He even threatened to publish a second, more damning exposé if Silas continued to promote it as authentic." "A second exposé, Sir Alistair?" I asked, intrigued. "Was there new evidence?" "Precisely," Sir Alistair affirmed. Elias had been working tirelessly, comparing the disputed manuscript with known Pergolese works. He claimed to have discovered a unique harmonic progression within the requiem that was entirely alien to Pergolese's style, but distinctly characteristic of a minor contemporary, a Florentine named Niccolo de Monteverde. More damning still, Elias had uncovered evidence that Silas Thorne had recently travelled to Florence, ostensibly for research, but in truth to acquire source material from Monteverdi's lesser-known scores. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And this evidence? Did Professor Thorne share it with you?" "He showed me several pages of analysis, meticulous as only Elias could be," Sir Alistair explained, a sad shake of his head. "He was preparing to submit it to the Musical Quarterly. The publication of that exposé would have utterly destroyed Silas Thorne's reputation, not merely as a scholar, but as a man of integrity. It would have exposed him as a fraud, a charlatan attempting to pass off a pastiche as a masterpiece." "And the financial implications, Sir Alistair?" Holmes probed. "Was there significant financial gain to be had from this lost requiem?" "My dear Mr. Holmes," Sir Alistair stated, his voice now imbued with a chilling gravitas. "The financial stakes were immense. Not only was Silas hoping to sell the performance rights to this Pergolese requiem for a fortune, he had also secured an advance from a German publishing house, a very substantial sum contingent upon the manuscript being authenticated by a prominent authority. Elias Thorne, as the leading expert, was the insurmountable obstacle. With Elias's death, and with his damning critique now posthumous and less likely to carry immediate weight, Silas Thorne would be free to proceed with the publication and claim his riches. A fortune, Mr. Holmes, built upon a lie and consecrated by murder. And you are certain of this financial arrangement? I inquired. Absolutely. I myself was approached by the publishers, months ago, to lend my name to the venture. I declined, of course, on Elias's advice, but I saw the contract. It was explicit. Sir Alistair steepled his fingers, his gaze distant. I also recall a strange encounter, only a few days prior to Elias's passing. Silas Thorne called upon Elias uninvited. Their voices were raised in argument. I overheard fragments. Silas was incandescent with rage, threatening that Elias would rue the day he stood in his path. Holmes leaned back, a satisfied expression upon his face. Sir Alistair, your information completes a crucial piece of the puzzle. The financial motive is now irrefutably established, and Silas Thorne's character laid bare. There remains only the curious matter of the locked room and how the poison was administered. Indeed, Sir Alistair said, a look of profound unease settling upon his features. How could Silas have done it if the study was locked from the inside? That, Sir Alistair, is the final movement of this grim symphony, Holmes replied, rising, and I believe I now possess the key to its execution. The afternoon sun, breaking through the clouds, cast long shadows across the Mayfair drawing-room, a stark contrast to the darkness of the unfolding plot. Chapter 5. The Unseen Hand and the Final Cadence. The following morning dawned clear and crisp, the London air scrubbed clean by a night's brisk wind, a welcome change after days of oppressive fog. We were back in Professor Thorne's study in Cadogan Square, Holmes examining the room with a renewed intensity, his mind evidently working at a furious pace. Mr. Davies, the butler, stood silently by the door, his usual stoicism tinged with a palpable anxiety. "Watson," Holmes announced, breaking a long silence. "The evidence, when viewed through the lens of Silas Thorne's desperation and ingenuity, points to a singular conclusion. We have established his motive, the immense financial gain from the fraudulent Pergolese's requiem, which Professor Thorne was on the verge of exposing. We have linked him to the unique South American poison, the alkaloid, via the pajarito de la selva, a family curio which Silas pawned for a pittance, implying he possessed other more valuable items, such as the poison itself. "But the locked room, Holmes," I pressed. "And how was the poison administered without direct contact?" Holmes strode to the writing desk, picking up the small empty crystal vial once more. "The poison, my dear Watson, requires only a minute quantity to be lethal. Silas Thorne, a man of music, knew Elias's habits intimately. He knew his uncle's fondness for a certain herbal infusion brewed specifically in his study each evening, a concoction that masked subtle flavours. The alkaloid, being almost tasteless and scentless, could be easily introduced into the infusion. But how?" He then turned to the grand piano, its polished surface reflecting the morning light. "Consider, Watson, Silas Thorne's desperation. He needed to silence Elias, and he needed to do so without direct confrontation, or at least without being seen to confront him. He called upon Elias days before, their voices raised in argument, a public display of animosity. This was a calculated risk, creating a potential false trail of obvious motive, diverting attention from the true, subtle method." Holmes then moved to a small, silver-frame photograph on the mantelpiece, a portrait of Professor Thorne and a younger man, clearly Silas. Silas Thorne, a struggling man of music, yet possessor of a rare poison and a forged manuscript. He had access to this house, Watson, in his youth. He knew its intricacies, its hidden mechanisms. The key, quite literally, lies within Elias's greatest passion. He turned to the grand piano. "Observe, Watson, the piano. Its lid is closed, and beneath the lid, the soundboard, and beyond that, the mechanism." Holmes opened the lid with a flourish, revealing the gleaming ivory keys. Elias, like all great composers, would spend hours at this instrument, lost in creation. He would, inevitably, require refreshment. Holmes pointed to a small, almost invisible thread, like a filament of spider silk running from the base of the open piano lid, snaking subtly along the underside of the desk, and finally disappearing into the mechanism of the silver box where the crystal vial had been found. It was almost perfectly camouflaged against the dark wood. The ingenuity of the criminal, Watson, is often matched only by his desperation. Silas, knowing his uncle's habits, prepared this mechanism during his uninvited visit. He attached a tiny reservoir of the alkaloid to a delicate hair-thin thread, which he then ran from the piano mechanism to the silver box. A subtle depression of a specific piano key, one that Elias would likely use as he composed, would trigger a minute release of the poison, dropping it into the waiting cup of herbal infusion, or perhaps directly into a prepared quill. The scent of jasmine, Watson, was a red herring. It was introduced separately, perhaps a spray, to mask any lingering chemical odour. The carved bird, a mere misdirection, meant to be discovered and lead us on a wild goose chase of exotic origins. Mr. Davies, the butler, gasped aloud. "But the locked room, Mr. Holmes. How did he leave without unlocking it?" Holmes smiled grimly. "That, Mr. Davies, is the simplest part of the deception. The window. Note the small, almost imperceptible scratch on the lower pane, and the faint residue of mud on the outer sill. Silas Thorne, an agile man despite his stoop, could have simply slipped out the window, leaving it unlocked but closed, and then, later that night, from outside, manipulated the sash catch to appear fully secured. The cold night air, the early morning fog would have masked any faint trace of his activities. The genius of a composer turned to villainy, I murmured, a chill running down my spine. A most diabolical plot, Holmes nodded. Indeed, Watson. Silas Thorne, driven by avarice and envy, attempted to compose his own grim finale, using his knowledge of music and poisons as his instruments. The sudden stillness of Elias Thorne, his hand upon his score, the faint scent in the air, the misplaced trinket, all calculated distractions designed to mislead. But the melody of truth, my dear Watson, once heard, cannot be unheard. A sharp knock came at the study door. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, alerted by Holmes earlier that morning, entered, his face grim. "Mr. Holmes, we have apprehended Silas Thorne attempting to board a ship for Rotterdam bearing a substantial sum in cash, and a travel document bearing a false name. He was also in possession of a most curious small carved wooden bird, identical to the description you provided. Holmes merely nodded, a look of profound satisfaction on his face. "Excellent, Inspector. It seems the dying composer's final notes have indeed led us to his true assassin. The case, my dear Watson, is closed. Thank you for joining us on this intricate journey into the world of Sherlock Holmes. If you've enjoyed